I found a condom in my husband Evan Rhodes's bag. I didn't argue. I drew acid into a syringe, injected every condom, and slid the box back. That night, the hospital called about Evan and a woman from my family. They needed consent to operate, and the next question made me see the betrayal wasn't just his, it was sitting inside my own bloodline. The day began like any other, quiet and uneventful. I was folding Evan's clothes when I saw his briefcase half open near the dresser. Something about it made me pause. Inside, between folders and receipts, a small red box caught my attention. The label was unmistakable. Condoms. My stomach tightened as I lifted it, checking the date. Freshly bought. Still sealed. Not a single one missing. There was no need for confrontation. The proof was already enough. I placed the box on the table and stared at it until the world outside went silent. I heard the shower running in the next room, his voice humming faintly under the sound of water. He always did that when he was in a good mood. The sight of that box made me understand why. I could have screamed or demanded an explanation, but I didn't. Instead, I felt an icy calm wash over me. Years of quiet patience turned into something sharper. My reflection in the mirror looked unfamiliar, still, focused, and entirely done pretending. I placed the box back into his briefcase carefully, as if handling evidence for a crime. When Evan stepped out of the bathroom, towel around his neck, he greeted me with his usual casual charm. He didn't notice the open briefcase. I watched him move, rehearsed and smooth, like a man who believed his lies had no cracks. He mentioned his business trip to Los Angeles, smiling as if I should be proud of him. I smiled back, matching his tone perfectly. Inside, I was counting the hours before he would pack that box, unaware that I already knew everything. Betrayal didn't need words anymore, it had its own language. While he packed, I started cooking breakfast. The smell of eggs filled the room, masking the bitterness rising in my chest. His phone vibrated on the counter, lighting up with a name I didn't recognize. He grabbed it quickly, pretending it was work. I noticed the small hesitation, the faint nervous laugh, the same one he used months ago when I asked about perfume on his shirt. Every lie had a rhythm, and I had learned to hear it. I served his plate and watched him eat, memorizing every gesture like it might be his last meal at peace. After he left for work, I cleaned the kitchen and sat at the table, staring at the spot where his phone had been. My hands felt steady, too steady for what I was thinking. I went to the storage cabinet under the sink where we kept old cleaning chemicals. A plastic bottle of drain cleaner sat in the back, still half full. I held it up to the light, watching the liquid move inside. It looked harmless, almost clear. But I knew better. That small bottle had power, enough to make sure no woman would ever touch my husband again. I retrieved a syringe from our medicine drawer, one we used to give the cat liquid vitamins. It still smelled faintly of disinfectant. I washed it, dried it, and laid it next to the acid bottle on the counter. Every movement felt mechanical, like following instructions I had memorized long ago. I opened Evan's briefcase again, the box still there, untouched. I removed one condom wrapper and tested the syringe on it, making sure the hole was small enough to go unnoticed. Then I began. One drop at a time, invisible, but absolute. A quiet act of retribution. The sound of the syringe piercing each wrapper echoed faintly in the kitchen. The repetition was calming. There was no anger left, only precision. Each puncture felt like marking the end of something I once cherished. When I finished, I examined the box. It looked untouched. Perfect. I wiped the table clean, washed my hands, and returned everything to its place. The briefcase closed with a soft click. I stood there for a moment, realizing I didn't feel guilt, only peace, and a strange satisfaction that finally he would face what he had built himself. That evening, Evan came home early, acting unusually affectionate. He kissed my forehead, complimented the dinner, and talked about how stressful his project had been. I nodded, matching his tone, pretending to care. He had no idea that his next trip would mark the end of everything. When he asked me to help pack his things, I folded his shirts and tucked them neatly into the suitcase, making sure the briefcase rested on top. My voice stayed calm as I wished him luck. Inside, I wondered what kind of woman would greet him at the other end. When he finally left for his flight, I stood by the window and watched the car disappear down the street. The morning sun felt too bright, almost mocking. The house was quiet again, just me and the ticking clock. I sat on the couch, feeling nothing but stillness. I had spent years building this life, trying to fix something already broken. Now there was nothing left to fix. I turned on the television for noise, but every channel felt meaningless. Somewhere between exhaustion and relief, I fell asleep with the faint smell of his cologne still in the air. Later that afternoon, I woke to the vibration of Evan's forgotten tablet buzzing on the table. Curiosity drew me in. He always said it was for work, but his locked folders told another story. One file was labeled personal. I tapped it, and to my surprise, it opened without a password. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Evan smiling in hotel rooms, his hand around someone's waist. The woman turned her face toward the camera in one of them. My heart stopped when I realized it was my cousin Maya. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. I scrolled through the images in silence. Each one was like being cut open slowly. Maya's laugh, her familiar dresses, the vacations that suddenly made sense, all of it tied together. She was family, blood, someone who'd spent holidays under my roof. The betrayal felt deeper than anything Evan alone could have done. I set the tablet down and stared at the ceiling. My pulse was steady, my mind sharp. This wasn't just infidelity. It was humiliation crafted by two people I once trusted completely. And soon they would understand exactly what that felt like. I made dinner that night as usual, chopping vegetables in perfect rhythm. The kitchen light flickered softly, reflecting off the knife blade. I wasn't hungry, but I needed something normal to do. When I sat to eat, the chair across from me was empty, just as I preferred it. My phone buzzed once, a notification from a delivery service. Evan had ordered champagne to a hotel in Los Angeles. It confirmed everything. I took a sip of water, smiled faintly, and whispered to myself that actions always carry a price, even if it takes a little while to arrive. The hours dragged until nightfall. I tried reading but couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying images from the tablet. Around midnight, I washed my face, planning to sleep. Just as I reached for the lights, my phone rang. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. The voice on the line was calm yet urgent, identifying herself as a nurse from St. Luke's Hospital. She asked if I was related to Alina Rhodes. The tone instantly told me something was wrong. I said yes, and she told me both Evan and a female companion had been brought in with serious injuries. For a few seconds I didn't move. I just listened to the nurse explaining that the injuries were chemical burns, severe and localized. They needed a family member's approval for surgery. I asked about the woman, and the nurse hesitated before saying her name wasn't confirmed, but appeared to start with an M. My grip on the phone tightened. I thanked her, hung up, and stood staring at the dark window. My reflection looked like a stranger's. I had imagined revenge, but I hadn't expected to hear it spoken from a hospital line. I went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and looked into the mirror. My eyes were steady. I picked out a black coat, applied light makeup, and tied my hair back neatly. If the world wanted to see a wife in pain, I would give them exactly that. Driving to the hospital, I felt neither fear nor guilt. The city lights blurred past the windshield. Somewhere ahead, under harsh white lights, my husband and my cousin were learning the meaning of consequences. I pressed the gas harder and didn't look back once. The hospital smelled like bleach and exhaustion. Bright lights reflected off the tiled floor, and people moved in hurried silence. At the reception desk, I gave my name, pretending to tremble just enough to look believable. The nurse guided me down the hallway where a crowd had already formed. I recognized my cousin's husband, Terrence, shouting at someone in a uniform. His voice cracked with rage. The words came out heavy and sharp, Evan's name, followed by Maya's. I kept my face composed, breathing slowly as I walked closer, watching his anger fill the space before I said a word. Terrence turned toward me, eyes bloodshot, his hand still shaking as he pointed toward the emergency room. He didn't need to explain. The look said everything. His wife and my husband were inside that room together. I wanted to feel shock, but all I felt was a strange calmness that came when the truth was too obvious to deny. Nurses rushed past, their shoes squeaking on the floor. I walked to the bench against the wall and sat down quietly. Around me, chaos reigned, but inside, it was just quiet. I had already grieved for this marriage long ago. A doctor stepped out, clipboard in hand, looking around for family. When his eyes landed on me, I stood up. He asked if I was Evan's wife and said the injuries were critical. Acid burns. The words felt heavy in the air. He needed my consent to proceed with surgery. My hand didn't shake as I signed the paper. I asked nothing more. He rushed back through the doors, leaving the smell of antiseptic behind. Terrence was leaning against the wall, muttering things under his breath. His body looked empty, like the fury had burned through all his strength. I walked toward the vending machine and bought a bottle of water I had no intention of drinking. My reflection in the glass looked calm, too calm. Behind me, the emergency doors swung open and a stretcher rolled out. The nurse said it was the female patient. A glimpse of dark curls and a familiar necklace flashed under the harsh lights. My cousin Maya. I turned away before Terrence could see my expression. I heard his voice crack, calling her name, his footsteps fading as he followed. I sat back down, unscrewed the bottle cap, and waited for the next stretcher. When they wheeled Evan out, his face was pale and drenched in sweat. The bandages covering his lower body were soaked through. He tried to lift his head when he saw me, but the nurse pushed him back. I stepped closer, pretending to wipe tears that never came. The doctor asked if I wanted to hear the update. His tone softened as he said there was extensive damage. Evan's body would survive, but his manhood would not. I nodded quietly. Inside there was no victory, only the kind of silence that follows when justice feels colder than expected. Before we continue and see how this story unfolds, Alina takes a breath, realizing her choices have set off something irreversible. If you're still here, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. It helps me know how far stories like this reach. I followed the gurney into the recovery ward, the rhythmic beeping of machines echoing down the hall. Evan's mother, Ruth, arrived moments later, her eyes wide with panic. She demanded to know what had happened. The nurses avoided her questions, explaining only that the situation was critical. Ruth's gaze landed on me, desperate for answers. I simply told her the doctors were doing their best. She didn't notice the lack of emotion in my voice. Behind the curtains, Evan groaned, barely conscious. I stood outside, listening to his pain through the thin fabric and wondering if guilt had finally arrived. Hours passed in the waiting area. Ruth paced back and forth, muttering prayers under her breath. Terrence sat with his head in his hands, shoulders trembling. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, the phone resting on my knee. When the doctor finally returned, he explained Maya's injuries were severe. She would live, but her body was permanently scarred. I caught Terrence's expression as the words hit him. His face twisted in disbelief and grief. I didn't look at him for long. My eyes stayed fixed on the floor tiles, each square cleaner than the life behind it. The next morning, I returned to the hospital alone. Evan was still unconscious, connected to a maze of tubes and wires. His face looked drained of all the arrogance it once held. The doctor said he was stable, but wouldn't regain full function again. He said it gently, as if it was tragic news. I nodded and thanked him. Standing by the bed, I stared at the man I once thought I'd grow old with. Now he was just another stranger whose choices had brought him here. There was nothing left between us, but memories that had already turned to ash. Ruth arrived an hour later, wearing sunglasses though it was cloudy outside. She demanded details, asking about the police and possible lawsuits. I stayed silent as she spoke, letting her words spill into the sterile air. When she realized the full extent of Evan's injuries, Her voice cracked. Her son's charm and ego had been wiped out in one cruel twist. I watched her crumble into a chair, her designer bag sliding from her lap to the floor. For years she had treated me like a burden in their perfect family. Now she had no one left to defend. When Ruth finally asked how it happened, I told her only what the hospital had said, that they believed the condoms were contaminated before use. Her expression flickered between confusion and disgust. She muttered something about Maya, then quickly covered her mouth, as if she hadn't meant to speak the name aloud. I walked away before she could ask more questions. In the corridor, I saw Terrence arguing with a police officer, demanding answers. The officer explained that both victims would be questioned once they woke. Terrence's face turned pale. I could see him realizing his marriage was truly over. Outside, the morning air felt sharp and heavy. I sat on a bench near the parking lot and looked at the rising sun. People rushed in and out of the building, carrying flowers, balloons, or coffee cups. I had none of that, just a strange emptiness. A nurse walked by and asked if I was all right. I nodded. It wasn't sadness that filled me. It was relief. The kind that comes after too many lies finally collapse under their own weight. I took a deep breath, started the car, and drove home in silence. The radio turned completely off. Home felt foreign. The smell of his cologne lingered in the bedroom, mixed with detergent and faint traces of perfume that wasn't mine. I opened the curtains and let light flood in, exposing everything that had been hidden. On his desk, a stack of unopened mail sat beside a framed photo from our honeymoon. I turned the frame face down. Then I powered on his laptop. The password was the same, our wedding date. Inside, emails from travel bookings filled the inbox. Buried between them was a hidden folder labeled Business. I clicked it, knowing it would be anything but professional. The folder opened to reveal a collection of hotel receipts, photos, and bank transfers. Every piece of evidence told a story of indulgence and deceit. Evan had been funding Maya's so-called boutique with company money. Thousands of dollars wired monthly to her account. I leaned back in the chair, scrolling slowly, forcing myself to absorb it all. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial, methodical, and arrogant. He hadn't even tried to hide it well. I printed everything and placed it neatly in an envelope. Facts, not emotions, would build the next phase of my revenge. The next day, I met Jordan, a private investigator I'd known in college. He listened quietly as I explained what I needed. Evan's full financial records, his hidden accounts, everything. Jordan didn't ask questions. He just nodded and said he'd call in a few days. I paid him up front and left without another word. On the drive home, the weight in my chest began to change. It wasn't pain anymore, but focus. Revenge wasn't an outburst. It was a strategy, and every move I made from here would be precise, measured, and impossible for anyone to trace back to me. When Jordan called 3 days later, his tone was uneasy. He told me Evan had multiple hidden accounts and that someone else had access to them. A woman named Maya was listed as a secondary beneficiary. My jaw tightened. He continued, saying the money wasn't just for her, it was also going towards something called Rhodes Development, a shell company. That name was personal. He used our last name to cover his crime. I thanked Jordan and ended the call. I stared at the wall for a long time, realizing Evan hadn't just betrayed me, he'd used me as camouflage. I drove back to the hospital that evening. Evan was awake, sitting up, his face pale and swollen. When he saw me, relief washed over his expression. I sat down beside his bed, pretending concern. He thanked me for staying by his side. I smiled faintly and asked how he felt, keeping my tone soft. The doctor entered soon after, explaining the recovery process. Evan would never regain full function again, and the pain would persist for months. He looked crushed. I murmured something sympathetic, my voice barely audible. Inside, I felt nothing but the sharp edge of justice. Ruth entered the room later, bringing soup in a thermos. She glared at me as if this was my fault. She accused me of not protecting her son, her voice trembling with anger. I stood quietly, letting her words hit the air and disappear. Evan tried to calm her, but his weakness silenced him. Ruth turned her attention back to him, crying about what the neighbors would say. I looked out the window, tuning her out. Her priorities were the same as ever: status over truth, image over morality. The Rhodes family was finally cracking from the inside. When Ruth left, I closed the door and stood by the window, staring at the skyline outside. The sun had dipped low, painting everything in muted colors. Evan spoke weakly, saying he didn't remember what happened. I nodded, not responding. I wanted him to keep wondering, to question every decision that led him here. The silence between us stretched until the beeping monitor was the only sound. He asked for water, but I didn't move. I just watched him. For the first time in our marriage, he was the one powerless, and I was in complete control. Later that night, I drove through the quiet streets, thinking about everything Jordan had uncovered: the shell company, the stolen funds, the photos. All of it painted a picture of a man who believed he was untouchable. But I knew his weaknesses better than anyone: pride, secrecy, fear of losing control. I stopped at a red light and looked at my reflection in the car window. My face looked calm, but the eyes staring back were sharper than ever. I realized I didn't just want revenge anymore. I wanted to dismantle everything that had ever made him feel powerful. The next morning, I dressed neatly and returned to Evan's company headquarters. I walked through the front doors as if I belonged there, because technically, I did. My name was on half the documents and joint holdings. The receptionist recognized me and let me in without question. Inside, I met Mr. Daniels, one of Evan's partners. He looked surprised, but polite. I told him I wanted to review company records while Evan recovered. His hesitation was brief. Within minutes, I was sitting in Evan's office, going through files that reeked of deceit. The walls themselves seemed to hum with secrets. Inside a locked drawer, I found exactly what I was looking for: proof of embezzlement, transactions, signatures, fake project names, and accounts tied to Maya's so-called business. It was all there, waiting to be discovered. I photographed every document and placed everything back exactly as I found it. On the desk, I saw a family photo of us from years ago, Evan's arm around me, his smile genuine, or so I thought. I stared at it for a long moment before flipping it face down. The woman in that photo didn't exist anymore. She'd been replaced by someone unrecognizable. Later that day, Jordan called again with a tone that made me sit up straight. He said there was more. Evan had made regular transfers to a children's hospital, thousands of dollars, each labeled medical support. I asked who the recipient was, but Jordan hesitated, saying I should see for myself. He sent me the file. The name hit me like a cold wave. Leo Rhodes, age 3, leukemia patient. The listed father was Evan. My throat tightened as I stared at the screen. It wasn't an affair anymore. It was a hidden family. The betrayal had just grown roots. I printed the file and stared at it for hours. My mind raced through the possibilities. A child, his child. Somewhere out there, Evan had been living another life while pretending to be mine. I thought back to every excuse, every late night, every lie disguised as responsibility. I remembered how he always said he wasn't ready for children. Now I knew why. He already had one. I turned off the lights, sat in darkness, and felt something heavy fall away. There was no love left to corrupt, only truth, and the slow, deliberate justice it demanded. The next morning, I decided to see the child for myself. The hospital records listed the location clearly. I drove there in silence, each mile deepening my resolve. The building was small. The walls painted bright colors that couldn't hide the sadness inside. I found the room and peeked in through the window. A little boy sat propped against a pillow, pale but smiling at a nurse. His eyes were large and gentle, too familiar for comfort. I realized he looked like Evan, but worse, he also looked a little like me. My stomach turned at the cruel symmetry of it. A woman entered behind me, the child's caretaker. She introduced herself as Mrs. Gable and asked who I was. I said I was Evan's wife. Her expression shifted instantly to fear. She explained that Evan visited often, always alone, always secretive. The boy thought his mother was away on a trip. I stepped closer to the bed, and the child's eyes lit up. He reached out, calling me Mommy. The word broke something inside me. Evan had shown him my photo, lying to both of us. I turned away, holding back tears. This wasn't revenge anymore, it was revelation. I stood outside the hospital room long after Mrs. Gable left, staring at the little boy through the glass. He played quietly with a toy car, unaware of the storm he was born into. I realized I didn't hate him. He was innocent, a victim of Evan's selfishness like the rest of us. I pressed my hand against the glass, feeling something unfamiliar, pity. For years I thought my pain was unique, but this child's existence showed how far Evan's lies had reached. When I finally walked away, I knew I wasn't done. I was just beginning to dismantle everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the boy's face calling me Mommy. My mind replayed the sound until it became unbearable. I got out of bed and opened my laptop. Evan's documents still sat in the folder, each file a weapon waiting to be used. I started organizing them into a timeline. Dates, transfers, messages, photos. The pattern was clear. His crimes weren't impulsive, they were deliberate. I created a new folder titled Closure. As I saved the final document, I realized I had stopped shaking. There was no going back now. The next morning, I drove to Jordan's office again. He looked surprised to see me so soon. I handed him the folder and asked him to prepare a report linking Evan's personal and corporate accounts. "This isn't just about money," I said. "It's about exposure." Jordan nodded slowly, understanding what I meant. He promised discretion. On the way out, I paused at his door. "If anyone asks," I said, "this never happened." He gave a small smile and replied, "It never does." The sound of that door closing behind me felt final, like a quiet click sealing Evan's fate. When I returned home, I found Ruth waiting at my doorstep. Her face was swollen from crying, but her voice was sharp as ever. She accused me of leaking details to the press. Apparently, the affair between Evan and Maya had become public. I told her I hadn't spoken to anyone. She didn't believe me, of course. She called me heartless, a curse to her son. I let her finish her rant before stepping closer and saying softly, "Your son destroyed himself long before I touched anything." Her expression faltered, and for the first time, Ruth had no reply. The media coverage exploded overnight. Articles spoke about the high-profile Rhodes scandal, pairing words like betrayal, injury, and lawsuit. Reporters gathered outside the hospital, eager for photos. I stayed home, watching it unfold from my living room. Each headline stripped away another layer of Evan's respectability. The man who once cared more about image than truth was now reduced to pity and whispers. I poured myself a glass of wine, muted the television, and stared out the window. The city looked quiet from up here, but beneath that calm, my plan was already burning through his entire world. Evan called me 2 days later from the hospital phone. His voice was weak, trembling. He said he needed to see me. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. When I arrived, he looked smaller somehow, the weight of arrogance gone. He tried to apologize, his words fumbling, half-hearted. I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear every excuse. He blamed stress, loneliness, temptation, every cliché he could reach for. When he said Maya manipulated him, I almost laughed. I leaned forward and whispered, "You destroyed yourself. She just helped." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream could have been. When I left his room, I passed a nurse whispering about the police inquiry. They wanted statements from both Evan and Maya once their conditions stabilized. I knew this would be my chance. I went straight to my lawyer, Daniel Carter, a man I'd trusted for years. I explained everything, excluding my part in the acid. He listened carefully, expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "We can use this, every bit of it." He began outlining steps to gain control of Evan's assets legally. For the first time, I smiled, not from happiness, but from strategy. That evening, Daniel sent over preliminary paperwork. Through Evan's negligence, I was already listed as a co-owner of several company properties. With a few signatures, I could secure most of them under my name before his accounts froze. It felt surreal, revenge disguised as legality. I spent the night signing forms, each page heavier than the last. When I finished, I placed the pen down and whispered, "You wanted control, Evan. Now watch what real control looks like." Outside, rain began to fall, soft and steady, as if the world itself was washing away every trace of who we used to be. Days later, Ruth called, her voice breaking. She said the family home might be seized if Evan's company collapsed. She begged for help, reminding me that I was still a Rhodes. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I told her I'd see what I could do, knowing I had no intention of saving her fortune. She had protected her son through every betrayal, and now the shield was cracking. When we hung up, I poured myself another drink and turned on the news. The Rhodes name, once spoken with admiration, was now a headline drenched in disgrace. Jordan texted late that night. "Found more." I met him at a small cafe before sunrise. He handed me a folder containing surveillance stills, Evan meeting with lawyers, transferring funds offshore, covering his tracks. One photo showed him handing an envelope to a man outside a bank. Jordan said the man was a fixer, someone who specialized in destroying paper trails. I stared at the picture, tracing Evan's outline with my eyes. Even broken, he was still trying to control the narrative. "Not this time," I said. I thanked Jordan, paid his fee, and walked away with everything I needed. I compiled the evidence into a sealed envelope and mailed it anonymously to the company board. It didn't take long for the dominoes to fall. By noon, rumors had already spread about internal fraud. Executives started calling me, asking questions I pretended not to understand. I acted surprised, sympathetic, and deeply concerned for Evan's mental health. By the end of the day, an emergency meeting was scheduled. I showed up in a tailored black suit, carrying nothing but composure. Every step through those glass doors echoed like a drumbeat. The woman they underestimated was now leading the cleanup. During the meeting, I presented the financial discrepancies I had discovered. The board members exchanged glances, murmuring about possible legal action. I played the role of the devoted wife, betrayed alongside them. When one of them asked if I intended to file for divorce, I said softly, "Right now my priority is the company's integrity." The words landed perfectly. By the time the meeting ended, I had secured temporary control of key decisions. I left the room feeling lighter, not because I'd won, but because I finally understood how powerful silence and patience could truly be. News reached Evan quickly. He called again, this time furious. His voice cracked as he accused me of ruining his legacy. I let him shout, waiting until he paused to breathe before saying, "I didn't ruin it, Evan. You did. I'm just signing the paperwork." He fell silent. I could hear his breathing, heavy and uneven. He tried to curse, but his words broke apart. I hung up calmly and blocked his number. That call wasn't a conversation. It was a funeral for everything he thought he controlled. The Rhodes Empire had fallen, and it hadn't even made a sound. Maya's family began threatening lawsuits. Her parents visited the hospital daily, blaming Evan for destroying their daughter's life. I watched from a distance, unseen. Her face was bandaged, her body frail. She refused to speak to anyone. The irony was cruel. She had wanted to take my place, and now she couldn't even face her own reflection. I didn't rejoice. I just observed. Revenge didn't need laughter or satisfaction. It only needed silence and memory. I turned away from the glass window, knowing neither of them would ever recover. Not physically, not emotionally, not socially. That was justice enough for me. Ruth called again, her voice hoarse and trembling. She begged me to visit her. I went, mostly out of curiosity. Her once immaculate home was a mess of unpaid bills and unopened mail. She sat in her chair like a ghost, eyes distant. "They're taking everything," she whispered. I told her the company might stabilize under my management. She nodded, too tired to resist. Before I left, she grabbed my hand and said, I should have stopped him. For a moment, I saw genuine regret in her eyes. Then she started crying, and I quietly walked out without saying goodbye. Weeks passed. I settled into my new position at the company, attending meetings, signing contracts, rebuilding what Evan had destroyed. Every signature carried a quiet sense of closure. The staff respected me, maybe out of fear, maybe admiration. Either way, I didn't care. One afternoon, I found an old note in Evan's drawer, a scribbled message reading, "We'll fix this, Maya." I folded it carefully and placed it back. There was nothing left to fix. Only the truth remained, and it had already done its work. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it whispered through paper and silence. Late one evening, while reviewing files in my office, Daniel stopped by. He leaned against the doorway, smiling faintly. "You've done more than most people could," he said. I looked up, unsure how to respond. He told me the divorce papers were ready whenever I was. I signed them on the spot. The pen glided smoothly across the page. It didn't feel like the end of a marriage. It felt like the end of a lie. When he left, I sat there alone, staring at the city lights outside, realizing I wasn't angry anymore, just free, and finally, untethered. Evan's condition worsened over time. Infections set in, and the doctors had to operate again. I visited once, standing quietly by the door. He was asleep, face pale, body weak. Machines hummed softly around him. I didn't speak or touch him. There was nothing left to say. For years, I had begged for truth, for respect, for love. Now he couldn't even form words. I watched him breathe for a few minutes, then turned and left. The door closed behind me with a soft click, the final sound of everything we had once been pretending to be. After that, I visited the children's hospital more often. Leo was recovering slowly, his energy returning. He liked puzzles and toy trains. The nurses said he was always asking when his dad would visit. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. Instead, I brought him books, snacks, and stories. One day, he asked why I looked sad. I told him some people have to lose everything before they can start over. He didn't understand, but he smiled anyway. In his small, innocent way, he became the only thing left in this entire mess worth saving. The weeks turned into months. Evan's company flourished under my management, and the board eventually voted to make my leadership permanent. Ruth's health declined, and she moved into assisted living. Maya disappeared from the headlines completely. I never saw her again. My world had been reduced to work, paperwork, and quiet evenings at home. One night, as I sat by the window, I realized how empty the silence felt. Revenge had filled the void temporarily, but it wasn't enough. I thought of Leo again, his laughter echoing in my memory. Maybe redemption could exist, even in the ruins. I met Daniel again at the courthouse to finalize the divorce. Evan didn't show. The judge signed off quickly, paperwork processed without delay. I walked out into the sunlight feeling lighter, though not joyful. Daniel asked if I planned to keep the Rhodes name. I said yes. "Let it remind me," I added. He nodded, understanding. We parted ways at the courthouse steps. The breeze carried a faint warmth that felt unfamiliar. I stood there for a while, realizing that while Evan's story was ending, mine was just beginning, one built on truth, not deception. A few days later, I visited Leo one last time. The doctor said his condition had improved drastically. When he saw me, he ran to hug me, laughing. His joy was contagious. "Mrs. Gable thanked me for the donations, not knowing I was the reason they existed." As I left, Leo waved from the window, shouting my name. For the first time in years, I felt something genuine, peace, small but real. I promised myself I'd keep funding his treatment. It wasn't mercy for Evan, it was closure for me. The innocent shouldn't pay for the sins of their parents. That night, I opened Evan's old journal, one I had taken from his drawer months ago. The pages were filled with ramblings about success, image, and control. There wasn't a single line about love or family. It confirmed what I already knew. He was never capable of real connection. I closed the book and burned it in the fireplace. The pages curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The flames danced for a moment, then disappeared. Watching it, I realized revenge hadn't destroyed me. It had refined me. The woman staring into the fire wasn't broken, she was unrecognizably whole. Evan passed away quietly 2 months later. Sepsis, the doctor said. I attended the funeral, out of formality. Only a handful of people came. Ruth was too frail to stand, and Maya never appeared. The priest spoke about forgiveness, about letting go of anger. I stood there, hands clasped, feeling neither anger nor sorrow, just a final, hollow silence. When the casket lowered, I turned and walked away before it hit the ground. Closure didn't need ceremony. It just needed truth, and I'd already buried that long before the dirt covered his name. In the following weeks, life returned to an uneasy normal. The company stabilized under my leadership, investors praised my resolve, and the world slowly forgot the scandal. Yet sometimes, when I looked out over the city at night, I saw flashes of who I used to be, naive, trusting, small. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone who understood both destruction and creation. I had lost everything and built something stronger from the ashes. I whispered to myself, never again, and for the first time, I actually believed it. After the funeral, Ruth sold what remained of her house and moved permanently into the care facility. I visited once, bringing flowers she barely noticed. Her eyes were vacant, her memory fading. When she did recognize me, she asked softly, "Did Evan ever forgive me?" I hesitated, then lied. "Yes, he did." She smiled weakly and fell asleep mid-sentence. Walking out, I realized forgiveness didn't matter anymore. It wasn't about who deserved it. It was about who survived without needing it. And I had survived, stronger than she or her son ever thought I could. The company's annual board meeting came soon after. Cameras flashed. Journalists crowded outside the doors, eager for a glimpse of the woman who had rebuilt an empire from scandal. I stood behind the podium in a charcoal gray suit, composed and steady. I spoke about integrity, renewal, and leadership. Every word was calculated, every pause deliberate. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. Yet as I smiled and shook hands, a small voice inside me whispered that success and peace were not the same. I had rebuilt the empire, but the foundation was still made of ghosts. After the meeting, Daniel congratulated me in private. He told me investors were already discussing long-term partnerships. I thanked him, though my mind wandered elsewhere. I asked about the final settlement from Evan's estate. He said it had cleared, everything was legally mine now. I signed the last few documents, closing that chapter officially. It was strange how anticlimactic it felt. Years of betrayal and revenge, reduced to a few lines of ink on paper. When Daniel left, I stood by the window, staring at my reflection in the glass. The woman looking back was unrecognizable. That night, I returned home and poured myself a glass of wine. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel amplified. I walked through each room slowly, running my fingers over furniture, books, the walls themselves. Every inch of this place had once been ours, but now it felt like a museum of someone else's life. I stopped in front of our wedding photo, still hanging in the hallway. My hand reached up, took it down, and placed it face first on the floor. It didn't fall with a crash, only a soft final thud. The next morning, a letter arrived from Maya. The handwriting was shaky, the paper wrinkled. I opened it carefully. She wrote that she didn't blame me, that she understood now what destruction really meant. She said she would never recover and was leaving the country to start over somewhere quiet. At the end, she wrote, "You won." I folded the letter once, then twice, and dropped it into the trash. It wasn't about winning. It never was. Some wars just leave everyone bleeding, even the ones who walk away standing. Weeks later, the press moved on to new scandals. My name faded from headlines, replaced by fresh chaos. The silence was both a relief and a reminder. I started taking morning walks again, something I hadn't done in years. The city smelled of rain and car exhaust, but it felt real, alive. Sometimes, I caught strangers looking at me, as if trying to recognize who I was. They never did. They couldn't see the story written behind my calm expression, that anonymity was freedom. I had spent years being defined by others, but now I finally belonged to myself. On a quiet Saturday, I visited Leo again. He was in remission now, his cheeks full, his laughter bright. Mrs. Gable told me he'd been drawing pictures of his new mom. When I looked at them, I felt my throat tighten. The drawing showed a tall woman with brown hair and kind eyes. "That's you," he said proudly. I knelt beside him and hugged him gently. For the first time in years, I felt warmth that wasn't tainted by deceit. This child, who had come from betrayal, had somehow become my reminder that innocence could still exist in ruins. I started paperwork to adopt Leo. The process was long, filled with questions about my intentions, my history, my income. The social worker looked skeptical at first, but over time she saw the truth. I wasn't rescuing him for redemption. I was giving him what none of us had: stability. Months passed, and the day finally came when she placed the papers in front of me. My signature made it official. Leo Rhodes became Leo Alina Rhodes. The sound of that name felt like closure, not revenge. Something finally ended without bitterness attached to it. That evening, Leo sat beside me on the couch, watching cartoons. He laughed freely, his small hand resting on mine. I realized I hadn't heard genuine laughter in this house for years. The sound filled the emptiness like sunlight through old curtains. I didn't speak. I just watched him, memorizing the moment. In that silence, I felt something shift. Life wasn't about rebuilding what was lost anymore. It was about creating something new from the ashes. The world outside could keep its noise. I had found something real right here, in the quiet between his laughter and mine. Days turned into months, and the business thrived. Investors called me a visionary. Magazines wanted interviews, which I declined. I didn't need recognition. I had already seen what fame did to people like Evan. At night, I'd sit by the window, watching city lights flicker like distant stars. Leo would sometimes wander out of bed and curl up beside me, his tiny head resting on my arm. He'd ask about his dad, and I'd tell him stories, not lies, but not truths either. "He was brave once," I'd say softly. That was enough. Some truths don't need to be told. One afternoon, I received an unexpected package with no return label. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Evan and me at our first company gala, smiling like the world belonged to us. On the back, someone had written in black ink, "People never change. They just learn to hide better." I didn't recognize the handwriting. For a moment, the air felt heavier. Then I tore the photo in half and dropped it into the fireplace. The paper curled and blackened instantly. Whatever ghost sent it had forgotten something important. I no longer feared the past. I had mastered it. Months passed quietly. I enrolled Leo in school, redecorated the house, and replaced every trace of Evan's life with new memories. The company stabilized completely, and people began referring to it as Alina's firm rather than Rhodes Industries. It felt symbolic, a full-circle moment. I didn't smile often, but when I did, it felt genuine. One evening, as I tucked Leo into bed, he asked if I was happy now. I paused before answering. "I'm learning to be," I said. That was the truth. Healing wasn't a finish line. It was a road you walked barefoot, one step at a time. I began writing again, something I hadn't done since college. Late at night, I'd sit at my desk and fill blank pages with stories that weren't about revenge, but survival. Each page felt like reclaiming a part of myself I thought was gone. Sometimes I wrote about women like me, women who lost everything but found their strength in silence. Other nights, I wrote about forgiveness, even if I wasn't sure I believed in it yet. The act of writing was enough. It didn't erase the past, but it transformed it into something that finally belonged to me. On Leo's 8th birthday, I threw a small party at home. Balloons, cake, laughter. It all felt new, like I was learning how to live again. As I watched him blow out the candles, I made my own silent wish, Peace, not wealth, not success, not control, just peace. When the guests left, Leo hugged me tightly and whispered, "You're the best mom ever." Those 5 words carried more meaning than anything I'd heard in years. They were pure, untouched by deceit. For the first time, I felt my heart unclench completely. The war inside me was finally ending. Late one night, I found myself standing by the window again, the city glowing in the distance. The reflection staring back wasn't haunted anymore. It was steady, calm, almost content. I thought about Evan, about Maya, about Ruth. Their choices had built the storm that once consumed me, but now the storm had passed. I had rebuilt everything from the wreckage, not to prove anything, but because I refused to let destruction be my last memory. I whispered into the dark, "I forgive you." The city didn't answer, but I didn't need it to. Silence was enough. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Ruth's care home. She had passed in her sleep. Inside the envelope was her will. To my surprise, she had left me her wedding ring, along with a note that said, "For what I never gave you respect." I sat quietly, the ring cold in my palm. I didn't cry, but I felt something heavy shift inside me. Forgiveness, maybe, or closure. I placed the ring in a drawer, not as a memory of her, but as a reminder that even the cruelest people can find regret before the end. Life began to slow down after that. I took more days off, spent more time with Leo, and found comfort in small things. Morning sunlight, the smell of coffee, the sound of rain. It was strange how peace crept in quietly, without ceremony. One evening, Leo asked if we could visit the beach. We drove there the next day, watching him run along the shoreline, laughing as waves chased his feet. I realized something profound. I wasn't haunted anymore. The ghosts had finally faded, replaced by the sound of water, wind, and a life that finally felt like mine. That night, I sat beside the fireplace, watching the flames dance softly. My mind drifted through everything that had happened. The lies, the pain, the revenge, the rebuilding. It all felt distant now, like a story I had once heard rather than lived. I took a deep breath and whispered, "It's over." The words felt final, not like surrender, but release. I poured the last of my wine into the fire, watching it flare briefly before dying down. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt like home, quiet, safe, and mine again. Months later, Daniel visited for dinner. Leo adored him, talking non-stop about school and his new friends. After Leo went to bed, Daniel and I sat by the window, sharing a quiet drink. He asked if I ever thought about dating again. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Not yet," I said. "Maybe someday." He smiled knowingly and didn't push. The silence between us was comfortable, not the tense kind I'd known for years. When he left, I realized I wasn't avoiding love. I was just letting it come naturally, without fear. That was growth. That was freedom. Spring arrived, bringing warmth and color back to the city. The trees outside my office window bloomed with pale pink flowers. I found myself smiling at the sight, something I hadn't done in a long time. People around me noticed the change. "You seem lighter," one employee said. Maybe I was. The weight I'd carried for years had finally lifted. The world hadn't changed much. But I had. Pain had reshaped me into someone who could finally breathe without looking over her shoulder. I didn't need revenge anymore. I had peace, and that was worth more than anything. One afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at a business seminar about resilience and rebuilding. I almost declined, but something in me said yes. On stage, I spoke about failure, loss, and renewal. I never mentioned Evan by name, but everyone understood. I told them pain could destroy you or refine you. It was a choice. When the applause ended, I stepped off the stage feeling lighter than I ever had before. The woman who once hid behind silence now used it to inspire others. The story that once broke me had become my greatest strength. After the seminar, a young woman approached me, tears in her eyes. She said my story gave her courage to leave an abusive relationship, I hugged her tightly, telling her what I wished someone had told me years ago. You're not weak for leaving, you're strong for surviving. Watching her walk away, I realized that every terrible thing I had endured had led to this moment. My pain had purpose now. It wasn't just my burden anymore, it was my message. That realization didn't erase the past, but it made every scar finally make sense. That evening, Leo ran into my office holding a drawing. It showed the two of us standing on a hill under a big yellow sun. "This is us," he said proudly. "You're smiling because you're happy now." I stared at the drawing, my throat tight. "You're right," I whispered. I pinned it on the wall beside my desk. It became a daily reminder that healing isn't about forgetting, it's about building something new on top of what broke. And sometimes, the simplest truth comes from a child's crayon drawing on a piece of paper. Years passed quietly after that. Leo grew taller, his laughter louder. The company thrived, not because of greed, but because integrity had finally replaced deception. I visited Ruth's grave once, leaving white lilies and saying nothing. There was nothing left to say. As I stood there, a breeze swept through the cemetery, and for a moment, I thought I heard her whisper. Maybe it was just wind. But I took it as peace. The ghosts were gone, not because they vanished, but because I had finally learned how to live among them without fear. That night, I sat by the window once more, watching the lights of the city below. The reflection staring back wasn't the woman who had injected revenge into her husband's life, nor the one who had lost everything. It was someone reborn through fire, calm and unshakable. Leo's laughter echoed faintly from the other room, grounding me in the present. I raised my glass to the night and whispered, "To peace, at last." The world outside kept moving, uncaring, unstoppable, but for me, time finally stood still. I had won, not against Evan, but against the darkness inside myself. Years later, I visited the same hospital where Evan had once lain broken and silent. It had been renovated since then, brighter, newer, full of life instead of pain. Leo was now volunteering there for his community project, helping children in recovery. Watching him laugh with patience filled me with pride. It reminded me how far we had come, how much healing had been built from ashes. I stood in the hallway where it had all begun and realized something: pain doesn't disappear. It just learns to live quietly inside you until it no longer hurts to remember. One afternoon, Leo came home holding an old family photo he had found in the hospital archive. It showed Evan, young and confident, standing in front of his company sign. "Was he really that bad?" Leo asked. I took a deep breath before answering. "He was lost," I said. "And sometimes lost people hurt others to feel found." Leo nodded thoughtfully, accepting the answer. I didn't need to explain the rest. He didn't need to inherit my bitterness. The past had already taken enough. It didn't deserve to touch his future, or the peace I had finally built. Life settled into rhythm. Mornings began with coffee and quiet. Evenings ended with laughter and light. The house no longer felt haunted, just lived in. I'd wake to the smell of pancakes, Leo attempting breakfast, his laughter echoing through the kitchen. I'd watch him grow into someone kind, gentle, everything his father wasn't. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at me, like he could see the history behind my calm expression. He'd ask if I was okay, and I'd always say yes. It wasn't a lie anymore. For the first time, I truly meant it. The company reached new heights under my leadership. Reporters still called occasionally, asking about the scandal, trying to revive old ghosts. I always declined. The past had no power unless I fed it, and I was done feeding pain. Instead, I poured my energy into mentorship programs for women rebuilding after betrayal and loss. Each success story felt like another layer of healing. People called me strong, but strength wasn't what kept me going. It was purpose, the quiet, steady kind that grows from surviving something you once thought would kill you. On Leo's high school graduation day, I stood in the crowd, camera in hand, my chest full of quiet pride. When they called his name, he looked straight at me and smiled. It wasn't the same smile Evan once wore. It was brighter, honest. After the ceremony, he hugged me tightly and whispered, "You did it, Mom. We both did." That single sentence undid me. I had carried his father's sins for years, but in that moment, I realized I had rewritten our story entirely. We were no longer surviving the past. We were living beyond it. That night, after the celebration, I sat on the porch with a glass of tea instead of wine. The air smelled of rain. The same way it had the night everything began. I thought of all the choices that brought me here. The betrayal, the revenge, the rebuilding. Each one had changed me in ways no one could see. My scars weren't visible, but I carried them like quiet medals of survival. I wasn't the woman who injected revenge into a box. I was the woman who learned to rebuild after the fire. That was my real legacy. Months later, Daniel came to visit again. He had become more than my lawyer over the years. He was my closest friend. We shared dinner on the balcony, talking about everything and nothing. The topic eventually shifted to love. "Do you think you'll ever open your heart again?" he asked gently. I smiled, looking out over the city lights. "Maybe it's not about opening it," I said. "Maybe it's about realizing it never really closed." He laughed softly, understanding. There was no rush. I wasn't chasing love anymore. I was letting it find me when I was ready. As seasons changed, I began journaling again, not about pain, but gratitude. Each entry was a reminder of what I had learned. Forgiveness wasn't a gift for others. It was freedom for myself. I forgave Evan, not because he deserved it, but because I refused to let him live in my head any longer. I forgave Ruth, because her cruelty had shaped my strength, and I forgave myself for the quiet vengeance that once guided my hand. Every page felt like releasing another chain I hadn't realized I was still carrying. Freedom didn't shout. It whispered, quietly and completely. One morning, I visited the beach where Leo used to play as a child. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, calm and alive. I walked barefoot along the shore, the cold water curling around my ankles. The sound of waves was the same as years ago, but it no longer echoed with sorrow. I knelt and let the sand run through my fingers, feeling how time erased everything it touched. The tide came in and carried away my footprints. Watching it, I realized that was life, constant erasing, constant beginning again, and I was finally okay with that. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from Maya again. She wrote that she was living quietly in another country, working as a counselor for women escaping abuse. She thanked me for unintentionally teaching her the cost of betrayal. At the end, she wrote, "We both suffered, but we survived. Maybe that's enough." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. There was no anger left, only acknowledgement. Some wounds didn't need closure. They just needed time, and both of us had finally given ourselves enough of it. The years continued to move softly. Leo left for college, studying psychology, wanting to help others the way he'd once been helped. When I hugged him goodbye, I felt the same mix of pride and emptiness every parent does. "I'll call every day," he promised. I laughed and said, "Don't just live." Watching him walk away, backpack slung over his shoulder, I realized my world had grown quiet again, but it wasn't loneliness. It was peace. The kind that doesn't come from forgetting, but from knowing you've already faced everything that could possibly break you. I filled the quiet with travel, visiting places I'd only read about. Paris, Kyoto, Istanbul. Each city felt like meeting a new version of myself. I wandered through crowded streets, anonymous and unburdened. No one knew my story, and that anonymity was liberating. In Paris, I stood before a painting of a woman with calm eyes and realized she looked like me. Not the old me, but the one reborn. Pain had changed my shape, but not my essence. I wasn't a survivor anymore. I was simply alive, fully, quietly, and without apology. One rainy afternoon, while sorting old files, I found the original deed to the company, Evan's signature beside mine. I traced the faded ink with my finger, realizing how little it meant now. The empire that once defined him was just paper and ink, easily burned, easily forgotten. I folded it, lit a match, and watched it turn to ash in the sink. It felt symbolic. Power, wealth, revenge, none of it mattered. The only thing that endured was peace, and I had earned mine. The flame flickered out, leaving behind only warmth and silence. I started a foundation in Evan's name, not for him, but for what I had learned through him. It funded rehabilitation for burn victims, giving second chances to those scarred by fire and accident. People asked why I named it after him. I always answered the same: because pain should serve a purpose. It was true. If my suffering could help someone else heal, then nothing was wasted. The past wasn't erased, but it was rewritten, turned from tragedy into something that might, someday, save a life instead of destroying one. That was redemption in its purest form. Years went by and the foundation grew. I visited hospitals regularly, speaking to survivors. Some of them asked how I understood their pain so well. I never told them the full story. I just said, because I've seen how fire can destroy and rebuild. Their eyes softened, and I knew they understood without needing details. Healing wasn't about explaining, it was about connecting. Every time I saw someone smile again after pain, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't pride or satisfaction. It was gratitude that life had allowed me to become more than my past. One day, Leo surprised me by coming home early from college. He was taller now, more confident, but his eyes still carried the same warmth. "I've been thinking," he said. "Maybe I want to work with the foundation after graduation." I smiled, tears threatening to spill. "You'd be perfect for it," I said. He grinned. "You taught me everything I know." In that moment, I realized he wasn't just my redemption, he was my continuation. Through him, everything I'd built would live on, not as revenge, but as compassion. That was a legacy worth leaving behind. That evening, we sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky burned orange and gold, a color that used to remind me of fire and loss, but now it just felt beautiful. Leo rested his head on my shoulder, and I thought of all the nights I'd once spent alone in darkness. "Do you ever miss him?" he asked quietly. I paused. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not the man he became. I miss who I thought he was." Leo nodded, understanding. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was calm, like closure finally found its place. The next morning, I received a call from Daniel. He told me the foundation had been nominated for a National Humanitarian Award. I laughed softly, unsure how to feel. Recognition was never the goal, but it still meant something. That night, as I stood before the mirror preparing for the ceremony, I caught my reflection smiling back, not forced, not polite, genuinely content. The woman who once hid behind fear and fury was gone. In her place stood someone free of both hate and guilt. That reflection was my truest revenge. Peace no one could take away. At the awards ceremony, cameras flashed as I walked onto the stage. I spoke briefly, thanking the donors, volunteers, and survivors who inspired the work. I didn't mention Evan, but I felt his ghost in the room, silent, powerless, and finally forgiven. As the audience applauded, I looked toward Leo in the front row. He clapped the loudest, pride shining in his eyes. In that moment, everything came full circle. I had started with anger, built from ashes, and arrived at grace. The applause faded, but its echo stayed inside me long after I left the stage. After the event, Daniel walked me to my car. The night air was cool, and the streets were quiet. He said, "You've come a long way, Alina." I smiled. "We both have," I replied. He asked what came next. I thought for a moment before answering. Nothing dramatic, just life. He laughed softly and nodded. As I drove home, city lights blurred past like falling stars. I realized how peaceful the ordinary could feel once chaos no longer followed you. For the first time, I wasn't chasing closure. I was already living it. Back home, I stood by the window, looking out at the skyline that had witnessed every version of me, broken, vengeful, reborn. The reflection in the glass was steady, serene. I whispered quietly to the night, "It's over." The words didn't sting. They soothed. I turned off the lights, walked through the house, and paused by Leo's childhood drawings still framed on the wall. They were crooked and faded but perfect. I smiled, realizing they told my story better than any photo ever could. From pain to peace, from ruin to rebirth. It was all right there in crayon. Weeks later, I began planning the next expansion for the foundation, a new children's rehabilitation center. I wanted it built in the same city where everything had started. It felt symbolic, a full circle of pain transformed into healing. During the groundbreaking ceremony, I placed my hand on the soil and closed my eyes. For the first time, I didn't see Evan's face or remember betrayal. I just felt gratitude. The earth beneath me didn't care about the past. It only cared about what grew from it. That was enough. That was peace, alive and tangible. When the construction began, Leo stood beside me in a hard hat, grinning ear to ear. "You think Dad would be proud?" he asked quietly. I looked at the rising framework and smiled. "Maybe not proud," I said softly. "But maybe he'd understand now." He nodded, satisfied with that answer. As the wind picked up, it carried the smell of fresh soil and steel. The sound of hammers and saws echoed like a heartbeat. This was our legacy, born from pain, rebuilt through purpose. Every strike of the hammer felt like forgiveness nailed into place, one piece at a time. That evening, I found myself walking through the nearly finished halls of the new center. The paint smelled fresh, the walls still bare. I imagined the laughter that would soon fill this place, the lives that would find hope here. Standing there, I realized my story was no longer about revenge or survival. It was about rebuilding. Every brick, every wall was a promise to the future, that pain could become purpose if you refused to let it define you. I placed my hand on the wall and whispered, "This is where it ends," and in truth, where it began again. The grand opening came months later. The city mayor gave a speech. Cameras rolled, and children's voices filled the air. Leo stood beside me, taller now, ready to take over someday. When they asked me to speak, I said only this: "What we build after loss defines who we become." The crowd applauded, but I wasn't listening. My eyes drifted to the sky, where sunlight filtered through clouds like quiet forgiveness. The ghosts were gone, but the lessons remained. Every ending had led to this moment, a beginning built not on revenge, but on peace. After the opening, I stayed behind when everyone left. The sun was setting, and the golden light streamed through the glass windows of the new rehabilitation center. I walked slowly through the halls, touching the freshly painted walls. It smelled like new beginnings, not like hospitals or grief. In the courtyard, a plaque shimmered under the light. It read, "Built from the ashes of pain, for the healing of others." My chest tightened. It wasn't just a dedication, it was my entire life carved into words. Every scar, every mistake, every loss had led to this. That evening, Leo and I drove home in silence, the kind that felt peaceful, not awkward. He played soft music on the radio, humming along. At a red light, he turned to me and said, "You did it, Mom. You turned pain into something good." I smiled faintly and replied, "No, we did." The light turned green, and the car rolled forward. The road stretched ahead, long and open, the city glowing like it had forgiven everything. For the first time, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The past no longer had a home in me. Weeks later, I started teaching workshops at the foundation, helping survivors of betrayal and trauma find their footing again. Each face reminded me of a chapter from my own story, broken but unbowed. I told them healing wasn't linear. Some days you forgive, and some days you bleed again. But both mean you're still moving. Watching them nod through tears filled me with quiet pride. I wasn't their savior, just a mirror showing that survival could look graceful. The woman who once sought revenge had now become a guide for others trying to escape their own fire. One afternoon after class, I sat alone in the courtyard, listening to the sound of distant laughter from the therapy rooms. A butterfly landed on my wrist, delicate, and still. For a moment, I froze, remembering the night everything had fallen apart. The acid, the hospital call, the fear. The contrast was overwhelming. Life had circled back to peace, as if proving that chaos doesn't last forever. The butterfly stayed for a few seconds, then flew away. Watching it go, I realized healing isn't about forgetting pain. It's about learning to hold beauty without fear. It'll break. Leo graduated from college and officially joined the foundation full-time. His energy filled every corner of the office. Staff adored him, donors trusted him, and the patients followed him like sunlight. One evening, I watched him through my office window as he helped a little girl learn to walk again. The joy on his face mirrored everything I'd fought for. He was the redemption I never knew I needed. When he caught me watching, he grinned and waved. I waved back, my heart swelling with pride. The cycle had ended. A new one, brighter and cleaner, had begun. Over time, my visits to Evan's grave became rare. The first few times, I spoke to the headstone, unsure why. Later, I stopped speaking altogether. There was nothing left to say. He had given me pain, and I had turned it into purpose. Standing there one last time, I placed a single white rose on the grave and whispered, "You taught me more in destruction than you ever could in love." Then I turned and walked away, the wind carrying the words somewhere I didn't need them to return from. That was the final goodbye I never said aloud. As years passed, gray began to thread through my hair, and fine lines framed my smile, but I didn't resent them. Each mark was proof of survival, of growth earned the hard way. People still called me beautiful, but not for the reasons they once did. It wasn't the surface. It was the calm that came from having faced the worst and walked out whole. When I looked in the mirror now, I didn't see anger or vengeance. I saw peace etched into every feature, like time had finally forgiven me too. And maybe it had. One evening, Daniel visited again, older now, with laugh lines around his eyes. We sat on the porch, sipping tea, as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Do you ever think about the past?" he asked quietly. I smiled. "Only when it teaches me something new." He nodded, understanding the weight behind my words. We didn't speak for a while, just watched the light fade into soft twilight. Sometimes silence between two people who've seen too much says more than words ever could. It wasn't romantic, it was human. Two survivors sharing a peaceful sunset without ghosts between them. The following morning, I received a letter from a woman who had attended one of my workshops years ago. She wrote that my story saved her life, that she had left an abusive relationship, rebuilt herself, and was now helping others do the same. I sat there reading her words over and over, tears blurring the ink. That was it. That was the real closure. Revenge had destroyed, but healing had multiplied. I had planted a seed without knowing it, and now it was growing in lives I would never meet. That was the kind of legacy that mattered. Time softened everything. The memories that once haunted me now arrived, like faded dreams, more lesson than pain. Sometimes, when I walked past a store window and saw my reflection, I'd barely recognize the woman looking back. She wasn't fragile or furious anymore. She was steady. I had outlived the chaos, not by luck, but by choice. It was strange how life rewarded you when you finally stopped trying to win. The peace I once chased now followed me quietly, patient and loyal, like an old friend who'd been waiting all along. Leo married a few years later. The wedding was small, intimate, filled with laughter and light. When I watched him dance with his bride, I felt tears slip down my cheeks, not from sadness, but from awe. The circle was complete. I had once thought betrayal ended everything, but here I was, watching new love bloom from the ashes of the old. After the ceremony, he hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for not letting the past ruin us." I smiled and whispered back, "You were the reason I didn't." That was the truest thing I'd ever said. After the wedding, I took a trip alone for the first time in years. I visited a small coastal town, quiet and slow. Each morning I walked along the cliffs, overlooking the sea, breathing air that tasted like salt and freedom. Locals greeted me with warm smiles, unaware of the story behind my calm demeanor. For once, anonymity didn't feel like hiding, it felt like home. Every wave that broke below reminded me of life's rhythm, relentless, unpredictable, and beautiful. I realized peace wasn't a destination. It was learning to live comfortably inside the tides. One evening by the sea, I lit a small candle on the sand and let it drift into the water. It bobbed gently, carried away by the current. I whispered a quiet goodbye to everything that had once defined me, the betrayal, the revenge, the fire. Watching the tiny flame fade into the distance, I smiled. The ocean didn't need to know my story, and I didn't need to keep telling it. The light disappeared beyond the waves, leaving behind darkness that felt, for the first time, safe. I turned back toward shore, lighter than I'd ever been. When I returned home, the foundation had expanded into multiple branches across the country. Leo and his wife managed most of the operations, freeing me to slow down. People still sent letters, thanking me for the hope the foundation gave them. I read every one, amazed by how far a single act of survival could ripple. What once began as vengeance had become a movement. I didn't plan it that way. It just happened, like healing spreading quietly from one soul to another. That was the true power of pain turned into purpose. I spent my later years surrounded by peace and simplicity, mornings with tea, afternoons with books, evenings watching sunsets. Sometimes I'd hear laughter from Leo's children visiting the house, their footsteps echoing through halls that had once been filled with silence. Their joy erased every shadow that ever lingered here. I didn't need grandeur or recognition. The reward was right there in those echoes, the sound of a life rebuilt right. For all the darkness I'd once walked through, this warmth, this ordinary happiness, was the light I had been fighting toward all along. One afternoon, I received a small box in the mail. Inside was the gold ring Ruth had once left me, now polished and shining. Leo had found it while organizing old documents. "Maybe you should wear it," he said. I slipped it onto my finger, surprised by how perfectly it still fit. For years it had symbolized pain, but now it felt different, lighter, forgiven. Maybe forgiveness wasn't something you gave once. Maybe it was something you kept doing, slowly, every day, until it became part of you. I smiled, realizing that was exactly what I had done. As time passed, I began writing my memoir, not to relive the pain, but to share the path beyond it. I wrote honestly, about anger, loss, and the messy, imperfect road to peace. I wanted others to see that healing isn't pretty, but it's possible. Each word felt like a farewell to a version of myself I'd long outgrown. When the book was published, letters poured in from people around the world who saw themselves in my story. They called me brave, but it wasn't bravery. It was survival written down, proof that light can grow even in burned soil. The book became more successful than I expected, translated into multiple languages. Interviewers asked about my past, about Evan, about revenge. I always gave the same answer. The past gave me purpose, but it doesn't own me anymore. That line traveled far, quoted in magazines and documentaries. I didn't care about fame, but I was grateful my pain had become someone else's strength. It was strange, seeing my darkest moments turned into inspiration for strangers. But that's what healing does. It takes what once burned you and turns it into light for others to walk by. In my final years, I moved to a small cottage near the sea. The air smelled of salt and jasmine, and every evening I'd sit on the porch watching the horizon fade into gold. Leo visited often, his children running barefoot along the sand. Their laughter was the soundtrack of my twilight years. Sometimes, I'd catch myself thinking of Evan, not with anger, but quiet gratitude. Without him, I would never have found this peace, this clarity. Pain had been the cruelest teacher, but also the most honest, and I had learned everything it came to teach. One quiet morning, I woke early to watch the sunrise. The sky shifted from gray to pink to gold, each color brushing the sea like forgiveness. I felt the chill of the air and wrapped a shawl around my shoulders. The sound of waves was steady, almost like breathing. I thought of every version of myself. The wife, the avenger, the survivor, the mentor, all of them had fought to bring me here. I whispered to the wind, I'm ready, not for an ending, but for the peace that comes when you've lived enough to stop fighting it. As I sat there, Leo joined me quietly, handing me a cup of tea. Still up before the sun? He teased. I smiled. Old habits. We watched the horizon in silence. He looked at me for a long time before saying, You're the strongest person I know. I squeezed his hand gently. Strength isn't about never breaking, I said. It's about rebuilding after you do. He nodded, eyes glistening. The sun rose higher, lighting his face, and I realized he carried all the best parts of me, the resilience, the grace, the capacity to forgive. My true legacy sat beside me. Later that day, Leo's children played by the shore while I sat sketching in a notebook. One of them, a little girl with bright eyes, asked, Grandma, were you ever scared? I smiled softly. All the time, I said. But being scared doesn't mean you stop living. She thought about that for a moment, then grinned and ran back to the water. Watching her, I felt tears prick my eyes. The next generation would grow without knowing the pain that built this peace. That was the greatest gift I could leave them, a life without inherited wounds. That evening, I lit a candle on the porch, the same way I once had at the beach years ago. The flame flickered in the breeze, but didn't go out. I stared at it, thinking about the first fire I ever started, the one that burned through my old life. It had destroyed, yes, but it had also forged something unbreakable. I whispered to the flame, You did your job. Then I blew it out gently. The darkness that followed didn't scare me. It just felt calm, complete, and full of memory. My story had come full circle. As night fell, I went to bed with the window open, letting the sound of waves drift into the room. The air was cool, soft, and filled with peace. I thought about everything, every scar, every loss, every lesson. It all made sense now, woven into one long thread of survival. I closed my eyes, smiling. Life had started in chaos, burned in fury, and ended in calm. The world outside kept turning, but I had finally stopped running. The storm had passed, I had walked through fire, and somehow I had come out shining. In the morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, warm and gentle. Leo found me still in bed, a faint smile on my face. He didn't cry. He just sat beside me, holding my hand for a long time. Outside, the ocean shimmered, endless and forgiving. The foundation, the legacy, the peace I built, they would all continue without me. My story had begun with betrayal and ended with grace. And somewhere far beyond what anyone could see, I hoped Evan finally understood that the woman he broke had not been destroyed. She had become eternal through forgiveness.